Thanks for making the time to join this morning to talk a little bit about university admissions. Absolutely, it is springtime, which means offers of admission are going out. Students are finding out how their applications have gone. Some are celebrating, some are a little concerned. So what I wanted to do today is I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the process that happens behind the scenes to get to those decisions. Our unit in Enrollment Services handles all undergraduate admissions at the university, so college transfer students, high school students applying to UBC. What I'm going to be talking about today is specific to undergraduate admissions, not really talking about graduate or medicine or dentistry or anything like that. This is more about the high school students trying to get into UBC. And so what I wanted to talk a little bit about today is how universities decide who gets admitted. What I'm not going to be talking about is how you or a student, an individual student, gains admission to the university. And there is a difference between these two things. And let me try and explain it, sort of what the difference is. I'm a huge soccer fan. This past summer, with the World Cup on, I was glued to the TV watching soccer games all the time. I can tell you how the World Cup winner is decided. Two teams of 11 men get together on a day. They play soccer on a pitch for two 45-minute halves. There's a little ball that they kick around the field, and they try to get into a rectangular net as many times as possible. The team that does that the most often wins the World Cup. What I can't tell you is, how do you win the World Cup? Do you use a 4-4-2 formation, a 4-3-3? Do you do a high press? Do you play defensively? Do you play aggressively? I can't tell you the strategy of how somebody wins. I can't tell you the strategy of how somebody gains admission. But I can tell you the rules of the game and how we decide who gets admitted. And this is important because the rules of the game have changed quite a bit over the past little while. So for a second here, I want you all to think back on yourself back in high school. Okay, so are you with me? Are you imagining yourselves back in high school? Okay, I'm seeing some people nodding. I'm seeing some people not. For the people who are not nodding, I want you to think back on yourself in high school, okay? So there you are. There you are in high school. You're getting ready to apply to university. What is the most important thing you need in order to gain admission? Anybody? Good grades. Absolutely. Your report card, your grades determine whether or not you get into university. Imagine being a student today where it's not just about the grades on your report card. Getting into university depends on how you answer questions such as, tell us about an experience in school or out that caused you to rethink or change your perspective. What impact has this had on you? Can you imagine whether or not you go to the university of your choice is dependent on how you answer this question. But this is what students are facing when they prepare for university right now. The things that we look at for admission are much broader than they've been in the past. So to put it into context, in 1990, if you applied to UBC to get into a Bachelor of Arts program, you only needed three things. You had to have the right prerequisite courses. We looked at an assessment of your grades in those courses, and if you had a 70% average, you got in. Fast forward 20 years. In 2010, more or less the same is true. We don't just look at 4 grade 12 courses. Now we also look at some grade 11 courses as substitutes. But we still only look at grades in 4 classes. But now you need an 87% average to gain admission to UBC. Fast forward to today. We still look for prerequisite courses, but now we're looking at your grades in all your grade 11 and 12 classes because every course you take in high school can have an impact on your admission to university. We look at personal characteristics, things like how you show yourself to be a self-reflective learner, how you answer questions about things that have changed your perspective. We look at what we call discipline-based competencies, which is really just a fancy way of saying, It doesn't matter it does matter what your overall grades are, but if you're applying to engineering, your math grade is particularly important. And even if your overall grades are strong, if your math grade isn't strong, that will hurt your chances of getting into sciences or engineering or commerce. We look at grade discrepancies. If we see a really high provincial exam score and a really high English 12 course grade and a really low provincial exam score, we will investigate why is there such a big discrepancy. We look at things like breadth, rigor, and relevancy. So it's not just what courses have you taken. Have you challenged yourself by taking a number of different courses? Have you taken more challenging courses? Have you taken courses that are related to what you want to study in high school, in university? And some programs across Canada, the most competitive programs, are also beginning to look at video interviews. That basically students are asked a question and then the record button is hit. They have to answer the question in a fixed amount of time and the computer records their answer and that gets submitted to the university. So we're looking at all these things to make admission decisions. Of course, when you look at this, you say to yourself, well, wow, it's getting a lot harder to get in. Look how much more universities are asking for. In reality, it's not getting harder to get in. Way back in 1990, when all you needed was 4 courses and a 70% average, we admitted roughly 51% of the students who applied to the Bachelor of Arts program. With all that additional information, last year, we admitted about 50% of the students who applied to the Bachelor of Arts program. We need all this additional information to help with differentiation because applicants are getting such high grades that they all look the same because their grades are all so high. We need more information to sort of make everybody look a little bit different. The second thing is that back in the day, you could answer quite clearly the question, what do you need to get into UBC? 1990, you needed a 70% average. 69.9, I'm afraid you don't get in. 70%, you do. Today, because we look at all those different things, you can't really answer the question, what do you need to get into UBC? Because if you have really high grades but a poor personal profile, you may not get in. On the other hand, if your grades are lower but your personal profile is outstanding, you might get in. So it's a bit more opaque now because it's a lot more comprehensive. And if you think this is just UBC, it's not. It's everybody across Canada. This presentation was put together with colleagues from other universities across Canada, and when we filled out this chart, it looked very similar. So here we have UBC, one of the largest universities in Canada, and here we have the exact same chart for Bishops in Quebec, one of the smallest universities in Canada. And whether you're talking West Coast here at UBC or East Coast with Dalhousie, the story is more or less the same. Universities are beginning to look for more in order to differentiate more, and when they differentiate and when they ask for more, it makes the criteria a bit more opaque. You can no longer say 85% average and you're in. Now, in that opacity is where we get a lot of rumor. Because when you don't know exactly what you need to get in, people start speculating. They start hypothesizing. They get stressed about what actually makes the decision. And in that stress leads to rumors and myths about the university admissions process. I've put up a picture of a unicorn because just like a unicorn, many people think these myths are true, but they don't actually exist. So what I've done is I've collected 10 of my favorite myths about the university admissions process. I'll walk you through them, and then at the end, if you have ones that you've heard or just general questions, I'd be happy to try and answer those. So I'll start with the 10 most popular, the most common. The first is, there is a UBC standard of admission. If you get refused, it's because you're not good enough for UBC. Or put another way, why do they make it so hard to get in? When people think of university admissions, they think of the scenes that they've seen in the movies. People sitting around a boardroom table going applicant by applicant, thumbs up, thumbs down. In reality, it works a lot different. This idea of putting each individual applicant into the yes, no, or maybe pile is a qualitative assessment that is done looking at each applicant individually. And while some universities in Canada do this, most do not. Most look at all their applicants as a whole, and they assess them quantitatively to make their admission decisions. And whether or not you get admitted is based on the number of people who apply for the number of spaces that are available. So there's two models that universities use in Canada. One is called holistic and comprehensive. The other is called grades only. Grades only is very simple. You take all the people who've applied, you rank order them from the highest grades to the lowest grades, and you walk down the list until you've filled all your seats. But you're never totally sure if you have filled all your seats, so you put some students on a wait list to see maybe later on in the cycle you might need them. But then the students that you know you won't be able to accommodate, you can straight out refuse. The holistic or comprehensive model is the exact same concept, except we're not just looking at grades, we're looking at your grades and some other assessment, a personal profile, a video interview, an assessment of how many courses you've taken, breadth, rigor, all those kinds of things. So how does it work? Let me give you a real example of how we determine who gets into UBC. These are real numbers from the Faculty of Arts a number of years ago. The Faculty of Arts has a target, 1,760 new first-year BA students. That's the target that we're trying to achieve in first year. Come January 1, I've got 8,100 students who've applied to the Bachelor of Arts program. Now, I have to start admitting, okay, the applications haven't closed, applications are still coming in. I don't know my total number of applicants, but I can't wait. I've got to get going. So what I do is I pick cutoffs based on last year that I'm pretty sure are going to make it such that I don't over-enroll. I'm conservative right off the top, and I start going. So imagine that I'm going to order all the applicants from the most competitive to the least competitive, and I'm going to give them a score. And I've put numbers up here, and these numbers are sort of imaginary numbers. It's an aggregate of your assessment of your grades and all those other things. Let's just call it a score out of 200. And I'm going to say, if you've got 150 or higher, I'm going to put you in. If you're between 130 and 149, I'm not totally sure. It's a pretty big wait list area. And then below that, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be able to accommodate, so I refuse. I start going. By February 1, I've got 9,300 students who have applied. My applicant pool is closed now. We're no longer taking applications. I know whether I've got more or less than previous year, and I can adjust. By April, I've admitted 3,100 students to the BA program. I now get grades from the Ministry of Education in British Columbia in May. I've been getting transcripts from all over the world, but as you can imagine, our biggest pool are BC high school students. So in May, I get grades from the ministry, and now I'm beginning to think, you know what, those initial cutoffs were too conservative. I need to drop a little. That being said, I'm looking pretty good, so I don't need quite as many students on the wait list. So I shrink that middle area. I drop from 150 to 148, and I release from 130 to 135. I tell those students, unfortunately, you're not going to be admitted this year to UBC, and I keep going. By June 1, I've got 1,800 students who've accepted their offer. These aren't admitted students. These are admitted students who are saying, yes, I'm going to be there next September. I decide I'm looking good, so I release a little bit more on the bottom end of my wait list, and I keep going. By June, I've registered 1,700 students. By July, I've registered 1,764. I decide that I need a few more students, so I drop my criteria once again. I'm pretty close to being full, so I release everybody else on the wait list. By August, I have 1,800 students who've registered, but I know that some of them are not going to show up in September. And then good enough, by November 1st, I have 1,779 first-year BA students. I am 19 students over target. Now, two things. One, this is miraculous. To get this close is really, really hard. I often joke with people when they think that admissions is a very, very scientific, quantitative exercise. I say there is a truth to that, but also let's remember that university admissions is about trying to accurately predict the behavior of 17-year-olds, okay? It's not an easy thing to do, right? So this is pretty good. Second of all, the cutoff was 145. We didn't determine that cutoff. It was determined by the students. If fewer people had applied, the cutoff would have gone down. If more people had applied, the cutoff would have been higher. If we had more spaces in first-year BA, there would have been a lower cutoff. If there were fewer, it would have been higher. So it's not about us saying this is what you need to get into UBC. It is supply and demand based on the students who apply. Now, whenever I state that, this leads to another question. If it's supply and demand, if it's essentially competition, how is the competition formed? And that always leads to this question. International students make it more difficult to get in, or international students take the place of Canadian students. Now, we often say they don't, and it's true, they don't. International students do not make it harder for Canadians to get in. How? Very simple. When I go back to this exercise, the 1,760 first-year art students at the bottom, this is domestic only. When I rank order from the most competitive to the least competitive, as you see on the screen, there are no international students in that rank ordering. The rank ordering for international students is completely separate. It's an entirely separate process that works in the exact same way for international. It's just they're not in the same competition. So whether a lot of international students apply or no international students apply, I'm still taking in 1,760 first-year students into the BA program. So with that in mind, people are always say, okay, well, that explains why international students are not making it more competitive, but then why is it getting so much harder to get in? This is the reason why it's getting so much harder to get in. This graph shows the admission averages of BC high school students, so no international students, just BC students, over a 10-year period. So on the left, you have the percentage of the applicant pool. On the bottom, you have the grades. Obviously, the higher the grades, the more to the right you are. This is what the distribution of grades looked like in 2008. This is what the distribution of grades looked like in 2016. High school students in British Columbia are getting higher and higher grades all the time. They're squishing over to the right-hand side of this graph, and it's making it harder to make admission decisions because everybody has really, really high grades. 2008, nice distribution. 2016, everybody's pushed over to one side. Now, some of you might be saying, well, what's wrong with this? It just shows that high school students are working harder, they're getting better grades in high school, they're learning more, they're being better learners. Well, maybe, but when we look over that same time period and look at first-year averages at UBC, from 2008 to 2016, the total change in first-year average is 2.7%. So if really all these students are that much smarter in high school, you'd think everybody would be getting much higher grades at UBC, but they're not. So this speaks to the competition of admissions defined solely by Canadians because everybody is getting higher grades. Now, when you see that the performance in first year UBC hasn't changed, this leads to the next question or myth. The reason it's so hard to get in is because of grade inflation. When you see that graph and you see all those high grades, you think to yourself, okay, well, that's grade inflation. That's teachers giving students grades that they don't deserve. Maybe, or maybe not. Let me present it to you in another way. This is a story that was in the CBC about 10 years ago about a teacher in Edmonton. And what happened was, this teacher, if a student didn't hand in a paper or did a really poor job, if they got an F, the teacher gave them a 0. And the school said, no, you need to give the student more time to do a better job. You need to give them more support. You need to say, okay, I'm going to extend the deadline so that they have more time to do better. In this case, this teacher did that. The student still handed in a very, very poor paper. Again, the teacher said, I'm giving you a 0. Again, the school said, no, you have to give the student more time, more support, more resources to help them succeed. It happened a third time, and this time the teacher was let go. Because the school system says, we need to do everything we can to support students to get the highest possible grade. I'll give you another example. In British Columbia, if a student takes a course multiple times, only the highest grade is recorded because the school system says we want to help students maximize their achievement. So imagine a scenario. A student takes math in grade 12 and gets 70%. They don't like their grade, they take it again, they get 80%. They don't like their grade, they take it again, but now it's the third time they're taking the class. They get a 95%. And they deserve that 95%. They've actually earned 95% in the class. But then they come here and they take Math 100. And they don't do very well. And the professor looks on the system and says, This student had a 95% average in grade 12 math, and they can't pass first year math. Grade inflation. There's so much grade inflation in the high schools. Is there? That student actually got 95% in math. True, it took them 3 times to do it, but they were supported and given options and opportunities to raise their grade as high as it possibly can get, but that doesn't necessarily translate into performance in university, and we don't see that information, so we can't use it in the admission decision. So yes, maybe there is grade inflation. Maybe there are teachers out there who succumb to the pressure from the students or the parents to give higher grades. But when the whole school system emphasizes mastery, which is basically a way of saying, take as much time as you need, take as many supports as you need to get the highest grades you can get, you get that graph where everybody's got very, very high grades. This then leads to the next question. Well, if schools do this, certainly you must be paying attention to the high school that the student goes to, because maybe some schools do this more or less than others. On this one, I always tell the students, call the university and ask. Most universities do not assess grades on a high school by high school basis. There are a few who do for the most competitive programs, but for the most part, universities in Canada don't. And that is a really good thing. We have a very, very high, consistent quality of education across Canada. This isn't like the US, where the variation from high school to high school can be very, very significant. Most Canadian high schools are very, very consistent, high quality, reliable, standardized curriculum, so we don't need to adjust on a school by school basis. To be honest, here at UBC, we've done this research. We have looked school by school across British Columbia to see if there are patterns. We don't see any consistent patterns by school. We do see consistent patterns by district. And so that raises a concern that if we begin to adjust grades by district, are we adjusting because of grade inflation? Or are we adjusting because there is a socioeconomic factor that's coming into it? Because it's hard to believe that all the schools in this district over here behave different than all the schools in this district over here. It's just the people going to school in those districts are different because of socioeconomic factors. So most universities don't do this. UBC has looked at this. We've decided not to do it because we'd be worried that if we did it, we'd be penalizing students based on socioeconomic factors, which would be very, very unfair. This is a good one for this time of year. Bishop's University sent me an offer of admission in January, but I had to wait until April to hear back from Dalhousie. Clearly, Bishop's wants me more. Maybe. People always think that the timing of the offer is a reflection of how much the school wants you. And sometimes that is the case. Obviously, a student who is applying to the most competitive university in Canada and the least competitive university in Canada is likely going to hear back from the least competitive university first, because that school knows they can accommodate that student in that rank ordering. But the most competitive university, we've got to figure out whether or not we can accommodate you or not. But in many cases, the timing is more a byproduct of the policies that the university uses. Some universities in Canada will admit you based on grades that you self-report to the school in November. You go online and type in your grades in November, and they'll admit you based on that. Some universities will say, no, we want to wait until we see some grade 12 grades. Well, obviously, if you're waiting until grade 12 grades, you can't make as early an admission decision. So it's not that the other school wants you more, it's that they have policies that are different from the other school. I can tell you that at UBC, we know that our offers of admission tend to be a little later than most universities in Canada. There's a very simple reason for that. We're the largest university in Canada to ask for the personal profile, where students tell us a little bit about who they are, what they've learned from their experiences. Last year, as you know, we read and scored 72,000 personal profiles in the admissions process at UBC. And we used staff and alumni to help us read and score those personal profiles. Obviously, if you're doing that, it takes a bit longer than just calculating an average based on a transcript, which is what many universities do. So our offers are going to be a little bit later because of our policies, because we want more information, not less. But does it mean we want you more or want you less? I don't really think so. I think it's got way more to do with how the school makes admission decisions. Another myth that is out there, and this is specifically for British Columbia, that I really like to emphasize here more so than anywhere else in Canada. Transferring to a BC university after 1 or 2 years of college or university work is not a good idea because you're dependent on first-year students dropping out in order to make space. We are very fortunate in British Columbia. We have one of the best systems of education, post-secondary education, because we have student mobility. We have a transfer system. BC and Alberta are the only provinces in Canada where you can go to any university or college and look up the courses that you're taking there, exactly what will transfer into the university. And if you choose your courses correctly, you will go right into second year. You will not have wasted your time. You will not have wasted your tuition dollars. And you are not fighting it out for a limited number of spaces for students who didn't make it from first year to second. We have lots of room that we allocate for second and third year entry. Even if every single first year student at UBC made it to second year, we would still have lots of room for second and third year entry. And the same is true for Simon Fraser, for UVic, for the University of Calgary, University of Alberta. These schools have second and third year allocations because of a transfer system. So it's really a great thing that students have that option here. Unfortunately, students are always worried that if they go to a college, it's going to be harder to get in. It's actually going to be more or less the same in terms of difficulty to get in from high school than from college, but it gives them 1 more year to prepare, or maybe in some cases 2 more years to prepare without losing time and without losing their tuition dollars. So it's a great way to go, even though it does make people a little uncomfortable. I can tell you that at UBC, generally speaking, for every 3 spaces that we have for a student coming in from high school, we have 1 space for a student coming in from another college or university. So basically, it's about a quarter of our entire intake are students coming in those upper years. Now, I mentioned the personal profile, and students will always ask, well, you're asking me all this information about myself. Do you really look at it? Do you actually read those things? Or do you just make admission decisions based on your grades? I tell students that this is a good question to ask to the university that you're applying to, because some will say, look, we really make admission decisions on grades. If you're right on the bubble, I'll read your personal profile, but if you've got a 99% average, you're just getting in. Some will say, no, I read everybody's personal profile, and it can have an impact on everybody. Now, the next question is always, well, if you read everybody's personal profile, how much weight does it carry? How important is it? When people ask me that question, I very politely say, I'm not telling you. And I'm not telling you not because I'm not a nice guy. I'm not telling you because it doesn't matter. So let me reframe it in a different way. If I was to tell you that the personal profile at UBC is worth 20% of the admission decision, and it's not, I'm just making up these numbers, 20%. How many of you would say that 20% is a lot, is a high weighting? Just show of hands. Okay, a few. How many of you would say 20% is sort of a low weighting? It's really not that much. Okay, I'm seeing a few more hands on low. Let me frame it to you this way. We used to make admission decisions at UBC based on grades in 4 grade 12 courses. So imagine that you're a high school student. We look at 4 grade 12 courses. English 12, pre-calc 12, biology 12, history 12. We calculate your average, and then there's the personal profile. If each of those 5 things was weighted equally, they would each be worth 20%. Now, tell me, how much effort does a student put into pre-calculus 12? How many hours do they put into preparing essays for English 12? Well, in reality, those courses could have just as big an impact as the personal profile, weighted at a mere 10-20%. The message here is that when a university is asking for more personal profiles, video interviews, all this additional stuff, they're doing it because if they use grades alone, the grades are too high. It's another way of saying we're becoming competitive. And when you're competitive, any one little thing can make the difference of whether or not you gain admission. The problem here is this. When we first at UBC brought in the personal profile, everybody thought it was great. You're looking at the whole student, you're getting to know the individual, you care about more than just grades, which is terrific. The problem is this, though. University admissions is a zero-sum game. So for every student I admit based on the strength of their personal profile, there is a student that I do not admit who would have gotten in on grades alone. Because remember, in that example of art students, 1,760 first-year BA, by looking at personal profiles, I'm not taking in more. There's a displacement effect. So let me give it to you in real numbers so that you can see how it looks. In 2016, looking at all UBC students who had applied, here's a distribution. On the left, you have the number of students. On the bottom, you have their grades. In green, these are the grades of the people who got in. So you can see the numbers of students with a 98% average who got in, number of students with a 92% average who got in. And here are the students who got refused. If we used grades only, one side of the screen would be green, the other side of the screen would be red, because it would be a hard cutoff. But some of those students with lower grades who got in because of the personal profile. And some of the students with the really high grades in the red who did not get in, it's because their profile wasn't strong. Now this is UBC in the aggregate, but I want to show you the impact of competition. The Bachelor of Arts program at UBC is one of our largest programs. Actually, it is our largest first-year intake, which means there's a lot of room. And a lot of room means it's not as competitive because they can accommodate more. So here's what arts looks like. Here are the people who got in, and here are the people who didn't get in. So for the most part, everybody in the 90s, for the most part, got in. But now look at a different program that's more competitive. Look at engineering. Here are the people who got in. Here are the people who didn't get in. Lots of students with grades in the low to mid-90s who didn't get in. Why? Their personal profile wasn't as competitive. So the point here is that when people ask what's the weighting, I would say it doesn't really matter because any little thing can make a difference, particularly when things are getting competitive. For engineers who didn't put effort into their personal profile, who didn't put as much effort into their personal profile as they put into Math 12, you can see what the end result was, because any little thing can make a difference. I also want to point out that this is a perfect example of supply and demand. Arts takes in, I would say, about 3 times as many students as engineering. If engineering took in 3 times as many students as arts, these two graphs would be reversed. Again, it's supply and demand. It's not about a program being better than another because of selectivity. It's because of the capacity that's in that program. The problem with the personal profile, though, is that it makes the admissions process more opaque. So you'll have parents say, my daughter has a 90% average, lots of extracurricular activities, and was denied admission to UBC. Her friend has an 86% average, fewer extracurriculars, and was admitted. Clearly, somebody made a mistake. One of the biggest misconceptions with the personal profile, and when universities look at things other than grades, is the perception that what we're looking for is a well-rounded student. We want to see somebody who's good in school and good in sports and good in the arts and good in the community and so on and so forth. There's a bit of that, but we're not just looking at well-roundedness for a very simple reason. If we just gave points for how much you do outside of school, that would favor students from a higher socioeconomic background. Obviously, you've got a lot more time to do volunteer work and to play sports if you're not working a part-time job to try and get money for your education. So we don't want to put that bias in play. What we're actually looking for in the personal profile goes deeper than just what you've done or what's on your resume. At UBC, we're looking at 4 things. We're looking at what we call engagement and accomplishment. We're looking at leadership, substance, and voice. Engagement and accomplishment is what you would think of when you think of activities. What have you been doing with your time? What have you achieved? This is the space where you get points for volunteering or being the captain of the volleyball team or so on and so forth. But there's also an element of leadership, and we really stress to students that leadership can be learned, can be refined in ways that are done in groups or done individually, where you've been nominated to something or where you've just taken it upon yourself. Students think that leadership is about being the president of the student government. You can play a huge leadership role in your school on your own initiative, getting involved in doing something that makes the community a better place. So we encourage students to think of leadership not just in a very singular way, but in a more take the responsibility upon yourself sort of way. Substance and voice are the last two pieces that we look for, and I can't really describe what these are. I mean, generally speaking, substance is about saying, has the student told us something that is insightful? Have they told us something that is meaningful? Are they using cliches? Have they relied a little too heavily on the thesaurus in putting together their personal profile? And voice is that quality that you can't quite put your finger on, but it speaks to the individual and you know it when you see it. I'll give you an example of what I think is good substance and voice. One of my favorite personal profiles of all time was a student who wrote, they were asked the question, tell us about something that has had an impact on your education and the way you view your education. And the student said, the thing that has had the biggest impact on my education is my part-time job at the mall, because I hate my part-time job at the mall. It's terrible. It's boring. It's mind-numbing. I hate every single moment that I'm there. But I procrastinate when it comes time to study. And when I start procrastinating, I think of my part-time job at the mall. And I think, you know what? If I don't get an education, this might be the best job I can get. And I know that because I look at my parents, who also complain about how much they hate their jobs, and they didn't get a post-secondary education. I want a job that makes me happy, and knowing that is what gets me to study harder. There's real substance there. There's somebody speaking with an individual voice. There's somebody who's learned something from a very mundane activity. They didn't go volunteer in the developing world. They haven't put 150 volunteer hours. They're not the president of anything or the captain of anything. They're just somebody who goes and works a part-time job at the mall, but they learn something from that. No different than our students when they go on exchange or when they do co-op or internships. They learn something from their experiences and they're able to articulate it in a clear and insightful manner. That's what we look for in the personal profile. And students, again, we always get questions, is 150 hours of volunteer enough? It's not a quantitative assessment, it's a far more qualitative assessment. It's much harder to get into the University of Toronto than the University of Calgary. U of T must be a better school. I put University of Calgary there because I did my undergrad there. So I wanted to, it's not about the individual institutions, it's about saying, what does selectivity mean? Is it surprising that the most competitive universities in Canada tend to be in the big cities? Because the truth of the matter is that a big part of how selective the school is about how many people are applying. And if you have 2 or 3 million people in your backyard, there's going to be a lot more people applying. So this question always comes up with the Okanagan campus. People are surprised to find out that the Okanagan, the admission criteria, very often for many programs is lower than in Vancouver. Is it a reflection of quality? Absolutely not. It's a reflection of the fact that there are way more people living in the Lower Mainland than there are living in the Okanagan. So selectivity sometimes is a proxy for quality because obviously schools that are very popular have good reputations, attract more applicants. But in many cases, selectivity is far, particularly in Canada, is far more defined by the local population. And last but not least, if you take courses that are more challenging, like IB or AP, you'll get a lower grade and it will hurt your chances of gaining admission. AP and IB, AP stands for Advanced Placement, IB stands for International Baccalaureate. These are courses that students take in high school that are essentially at the first-year university level. So obviously, if they're first-year university level, they are harder classes, which means their grades tend to be lower. And students often think that we just look at grades with no interpretation or analysis whatsoever, and that's not the case. So if a student was going to challenge themselves in high school by taking more difficult courses, my advice would be call the university that you're interested in applying to and ask, do you adjust grades if I take more rigorous coursework? I can certainly tell you that UBC, we do this all the time. We do a lot of analysis on how students perform based on curricula from all over the world, and so we adjust. So an 80% from one jurisdiction is not the same thing as an 80% from another. The proof is in the pudding. This slide here shows the percentage of students coming from different curricula in Canada who gained admission. On the far left, you see students who presented at least one AP class. The next one over is at least one IB certificate. The next one over is the full IB diploma. These are students that are more or less doing about 2/3 of first-year university while still in high school. And then on the far right, everybody else in Canada, the traditional grade 12 high school graduation. The students in AP and IB, I guarantee you, get lower grades because they're taking harder classes. But their rate of admission is higher because we understand those classes are higher and we do an adjustment. Now, I want to be clear here that there is a real chicken and egg argument. I don't want this to look like UBC or any university favors one curriculum over another. The truth is that top students are attracted to a more rigorous curriculum. So AP and IB have attracted some of the strongest students. My guess is that those individuals would have gotten in whether they went into the IB or the AP or not, because they're strong students. And a good student is a good student is a good student, regardless of the curriculum that they come from. So those are my top 10 favorite myths that are out there. I wanted to create a little bit of space. Should you have any questions about what I've just talked about, or if there are some fun myths that you've heard that you want confirmed or denied?
Knowing that there's that grade creep towards the present day, how do you adjust for students who might want to come back and do engineering as a 35-year-old or a 40-year-old instead of an 18-year-old?
So the question is, how do we look at mature students? Mature students is a very misunderstood concept here, because in most parts of Canada, mature means, well, if you're over a certain age, we sort of make it easier for you to get in. To some extent, there's more flexibility there because you've got life experience, so on and so forth. We don't really do too much of that at UBC because there is the college transfer system. Put another way, if you wanted to be an engineer in another part of Canada and you're 30 years old, you need that flexibility, because if you don't get into the engineering program at the university, you're not going to be an engineer. But here, because of that college transfer system, we would tell a mature student, if you go do a year at the college, if you go to a year in another program, you can transfer into second year without wasting your time or your money, and therefore we can make a much better admission decision by saying, I'm going to look at your grades in first year coursework, as opposed to just saying, oh, you're 30, I'm going to give you some flexibility. It's a much more quantitative decision, but without creating barriers, because there are so many places you can do your first year in BC, in Alberta, because of the transfer system. And just to be clear, BC and Alberta, there are other provinces that have the transfer system. BC and Alberta's is by far the most comprehensive. It really is a great deal of student mobility.
My question is around those students that don't get in. So with mental health being at the forefront with the university, I'm wondering if there are any resources or tools or direction that you provide students or parents to those who don't get into the university, and if you can share any guidance on how we can address that question.
That's a great question. And I'm going to answer that question the same way I answered the previous question, and that is to say that we're very fortunate here that the answer, in terms of getting an education, the answer is very rarely no. If you apply to UBC Engineering and you don't get in, we're not saying, well, you're never going to be an engineer. We're saying you may need to go somewhere else and do a year and then transfer in. There are more opportunities. So it's very rare that a no is a final no, because there are ways to get in second and third year. Now, that being said, I appreciate that many students want to enter into the university directly. I appreciate that there are pressures from parents, from the community, pressures that they place upon themselves. Often that is not seen as desirable an option. I always encourage the students to think not of where you're starting, think of where you're ending. If you do 1 or 2 years somewhere else and then transfer to UBC and get a degree, you get the same degree as the person who was here from day one. All our research tells us that the students who transfer in later on do just as well later on down the line. You will have the same credential, you will have the same opportunities, even though you're not here in year one. And hopefully that provides the knowledge that there are different ways to get at it. That's sort of my first answer. My second answer is that we are very fortunate in Canada that there's a consistently high quality of education across the board. And there is a seat for somebody everywhere. In BC right now, there are empty seats in the post-secondaries, which means there is capacity. Now, it may not be at the school of your choice. You may have a preference for this school over the other. And I appreciate that that's disappointing. But if you focus on the goal, and the goal is getting an education in the area that you're interested in, there is capacity, and you will find a place if you just look past that initial disappointment of not getting into my preferred choice. I'll just tack on one more thing to that, and that is, I know that sometimes the answer to that is, yes, but this is a better school. I'm going to get more opportunity there. I would flip it around. People think that a great university will make the most out of any student. I would argue that a great student will make the most out of any university. And it doesn't matter where you go. If you're a strong student and you float to the top, the opportunities are going to come your way, whether it's big school, small school, high-profile school, medium-profile school. Great students always float to the top.
First of all, I'm not from Canada. I've been here for about 3 years, and I went through extensive higher ed in the US.
Yep.
And I was prepared throughout high school and advanced courses for the other section, which was, who are you? What's your voice? And I'm fascinated by the nurturing of students by the ability to take courses again here. But also I wondered on top of that, what kind of preparation is done for the voice and the other section in high schools to let students know that that can be really important in a cutoff, especially if their grades aren't as high.
We put a lot of resources on the web to help students understand. That rubric that you saw, the little puzzle pieces, we put it on the web. We explain. We really try and get people thinking, moving away from the idea that it's just about your resume. That being said, we need to remember that the admissions process is fundamentally about a competition and about differentiating amongst students. Put another way, if you had an amazing school that could take any student and make them a straight A student, that would be wonderful from an educational point of view. But from a university admissions point of view, if I've only got one seat left, how do I figure out who to give that seat to? So we do preparation, we give people information, but at the end of the day, it is a competition, right? One example I can think of is a counselor once called me and said the same thing. I've got a great student and they're looking at the personal profile and they don't know what to say. They don't know what to respond. I said, well, shared some of the insight that I've shared with you today and look at the video online and look at, think about experiences that have changed your perspective. And then the counselor called me back a week later and said, I shared all that with the student. He still doesn't know what to write. My answer is, well, there you have it. I mean, that student is less competitive. They're not as strong as a self-reflective learner as somebody else. Will they get there one day? Maybe. But right now, I have to make decisions of who gets that last seat. And so it's factored in. So to answer your question, we provide information, we provide support, we provide the help. But the idea here is not to make every single applicant submit a perfect straight A personal profile. A part of it is about the individual, and it is competitive.
So I had one other follow-up on that, and that is that you talked about students who have gone through that process many times in improving their grade, then failing when they get into school, and that's speaking to what you just said. I'm wondering if you have any data or information on students that get in that have spectacular personal profiles, but maybe also have that problem. So interesting.
So we know that the personal profiles have an effect, but it has a small effect. There are certain aspects of a student who gets in on a personal profile who wouldn't have gotten in on grades alone that show higher levels of engagement. That being said, in my opinion, the best thing about the personal profile is not about re-engineering the class at UBC. It's about making higher levels of access. In a grades-only world, if you want to get into the engineering program, if the cutoff is 93 and you have a 92, don't even bother applying, right? It's a straight cut. The personal profile allows us to tell a student, look, whether you've got grades in the mid-80s or the high 80s, you're in the running. Here's an opportunity for you to shine. Now, that being said, it is still competitive. So really, for hyper-competitive programs, if your grades are in the 70s, it's going to be really hard to have a personal profile that strong to mitigate the grades so that you become competitive. But generally speaking, we know that students are a little more engaged on campus, but in my mind, the benefit of the personal profile is not performance here. It's about creating greater access in the admissions process. Yes?
There. I'm wondering, the personal profiles, it seems like there's a lot of time for the students to do them, and concerns or ways that we navigate heavily coached or professionally prepared ones?
That's a great question. It's one that comes up all the time. We do have some techniques to look for plagiarism in the personal profile, but I would love to tell you that they're foolproof, but they're not. Obviously, there are cases where parents, counselors, teachers may coach a student in terms of how to write the personal profile. It's a fine line. If that counselor that I talked about before pushed the student to say, okay, so you did volunteer work. What did you learn from that? That's sort of acceptable coaching. That's pushing. Saying, I think you should write this, I think you should write the other, is clearly not. And it's very hard to tell. It's very hard to identify that. The way I would put it is, on one hand, yes, it's hard to use the personal profile to be 100% sure of the validity of it, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't use it, because frankly, it's impossible to be 100% certain of the validity of grades. If a student got somebody to write their English 12 paper and submitted it under their name, that also would inflate their chances of getting into UBC, and that's the same concept. It's the same level of plagiarism in my mind. So is it a problem? Yes, it is. Is it something we're aware of? Yes. Is it something that we can police? No. Not as much as we'd like to. There are some things we can do. But does that mean that we shouldn't use it? I think that we always have to take a chance that the student is being honest, that the school is being honest, and that this is an accurate assessment of who the student is and how they've performed.
Hi. So super quick, we do get questions from alumni who are older asking or saying that if they were applying now, they'd never get in. Besides going into this full presentation slideshow, is there maybe one or two sentences you can offer to answer that question?
I would answer with the statistic that I had at one of the very earliest slides. 30 years ago, to get into UBC, the grades were way lower. 30 years ago, your chances of getting into UBC Arts were the same as they are today. 50% admission rate. My guess is that students always, to some extent, do what they need to do to get in. And if 30 years ago students knew that they needed 90% to get in, they would have gotten 90%. But 30 years ago, they knew they could get in with a 70, and so that's what they did. So again, you would think that in 1990, when we weren't looking for a 70, we would have admitted everybody. It'd be 90% admission rate. It's a 50% admission rate, no different than it is today.